The Mystery of the Little People, Mushrooms. Unlocking the Secrets of Hallucinogenic Boletes.
Dive into the ultimate mycological whodunit. In this deep dive, we explore hallucinogenic bolete mushrooms, specifically Lanmaoa asiatica, infamous for causing bizarre Lilliputian hallucinations, vivid visions of tiny marching people known as the Xiaoren. From the controversial historical reports of mushroom madness in the highlands of Papua New Guinea to a buzzy 2023 dinner involving U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in Yunnan, China, we unpack the history, the culinary practices, and the cutting-edge 2026 science attempting to identify completely unknown psychoactive compounds. Perfect for the curious learner who loves a scientific mystery.
Hallucinogenic bolete mushrooms, Lanmaoa asiatica, Xiaoren, Lilliputian hallucinations, mushroom madness, psychedelic fungi, Colin Domnauer, Bryn Dentinger, Janet Yellen mushroom, psychoactive boletes.
Welcome to the deep dive. I want you to imagine just for a second that you're sitting at your kitchen table. You've just finished a really delicious savory meal of wild foraged mushrooms.
Sounds pretty ideal, honestly.
Right. And you feel perfectly fine. But a few hours later, something strange starts to happen to your perception. The geometry of your kitchen subtly shifts.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. You look down at your shoes, and suddenly the shoelaces transform into vividly colored butterflies, and they actually physically detach from the canvas and flutter away toward the ceiling.
That is highly specific.
It gets weirder. You blink, trying to clear your vision, and when you look back at the wooden table, there is an entire regiment of tiny 2-inch tall soldiers marching in perfect formation past your salt shaker.
Just right across the table.
Right across the table. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a whimsical fairy tale or maybe a heavily produced fantasy film. But there's a real naturally occurring mushroom that induces exactly this hyper-specific experience.
And it is one of the most baffling things in modern botany.
Totally. So today our mission is to explore one of the most incredible ethnomycological mysteries on the planet. We are looking into hallucinogenic bolete mushrooms. We're pulling from a comprehensive, deeply sourced Wikipedia article today. It breaks down the history, the global geography, and the ongoing scientific scramble to figure out exactly what these mysterious fungi are doing to the human brain.
Because the absolute craziest part of this entire story is that modern science, right up to the present day in 2026, still hasn't figured out exactly what chemical is causing this.
Or how it even works. Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about these specific boletes, we are largely looking at varieties that have a very alarming biological trait, right?
Yeah, the blue staining.
Right. When you cut or bruise their flesh, they almost instantly oxidize. They stain this deep, violent, vibrant blue.
Which is fascinating from a biological standpoint. I mean, in the fungal kingdom, that kind of rapid oxidation is often a neon warning sign to predators, like, do not eat me.
Right. But the core of this mystery isn't the physical appearance.
No, it's the deeply unusual psychological effect it produces when humans consume it. In clinical terms, what you just described with the tiny soldiers, that is known as a Lilliputian hallucination.
Yeah. Named after the tiny inhabitants of Lilliput in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels.
Exactly. It refers to the visual hallucination of miniature people, or sometimes miniature animals or objects, and they interact with the real-world environment.
And they have a very specific name for this in China, don't they?
They do. In the Yunnan province of China, where these mushrooms were actually widely consumed, the locals have a very affectionate name for them. They call them the Xiaoren mushrooms.
Which translates to little people.
Right, little people. And what's fascinating here is that this is an incredibly rare, hyper-specific type of hallucination that is completely inconsistent with the effects of classic psychedelic mushrooms.
Yeah, because when most people hear magic mushrooms, their minds immediately go to psilocybin.
Which targets serotonin receptors.
Right. Or maybe Amanita muscaria, that classic red mushroom with the white spots.
Which hits the GABA receptors.
Exactly. But those traditional compounds produce a really wide, unpredictable range of sensory distortions, like you might get breathing walls or a sense of ego dissolution.
Or intense emotional shifts.
Right. They don't typically conjure up consistent, identical armies of tiny people marching across a table. And our source material details a massive 1991 hospital report out of Yunnan that perfectly illustrates how vivid this is.
That study's wild.
It is. The researchers analyzed 300 separate cases of poisoning from a local mushroom known as Xiaomei nuganjun. What exactly were these patients reporting on a clinical level?
The reports from that 1991 hospital study are just staggering in their consistency. While patients did experience some broader sensory distortions, like the shoelaces turning into butterflies, the unifying symptom across these 300 isolated cases was always the xiao ren ren.
The little people.
Yes. Patients described feeling as though they had suddenly entered a fully realized miniature kingdom.
One patient even reported seeing little people less than 33 centimeters tall popping up everywhere, and they had very specific outfits. They were wearing red and green clothing, they had highly diverse facial features, and they were incredibly lively and mischievous.
The patient could even hear their little voices talking to each other.
Yeah. Another person in the study saw rabbits and squirrels appearing out of thin air and genuinely felt that these phantom animals were trying to bite her. And the duration of these visions, it isn't just a quick, fleeting trip.
Not at all. And that duration is one of the most alarming aspects for clinicians. Most of these cases took several days to fully resolve.
Days.
Days. But some patients remained in this altered state for 10 to 30 days.
That is terrifying.
And in the rarest, most extreme instances documented in that hospital report, the hallucinations persisted for over a month, and to half a year in one case.
Wow.
That extreme timeline highlights a very grounded medical reality.
Mm.
While seeing mischievous little people might sound fun or whimsical in a vacuum, the actual lived experience of this intoxication can be incredibly distressing.
Well, yeah, I mean, the 1991 Union report noted severe dangerous symptoms. We're talking psychosis-like or schizophrenia-like states, threatening auditory hallucinations, complete personality disintegration.
And periods of profound stupor.
So the brain is essentially short-circuiting under the weight of these compounds.
Yes. When researchers hooked these patients up to an EEG to monitor their brain activity during those periods of stupor, they found electrical changes that closely resembled the brain patterns of someone under the heavy influence of LSD.
But they found a pharmacological clue in that hospital data too, right?
They did. The medical staff found that administering chlorpromazine, which is a very standard old-school antipsychotic medication, was highly effective in managing the symptoms and bringing them out of the psychosis.
And chlorpromazine primarily works by blocking dopamine receptors, though it does affect serotonin.
Right. So that gives researchers a tiny initial breadcrumb regarding the neurochemical pathways these mushrooms might be hijacking.
It grounds the bizarre sci-fi nature of the hallucinations in very real human biology. And the emotional toll of that biology can be profound.
Definitely.
The sources recount a deeply tragic news article from 2014 about a woman in Yunnan. She was purposefully and repeatedly eating these toxic boletes, but she wasn't doing it recreationally.
Oh.
She was intentionally poisoning herself, specifically so she could enter that hallucinatory state and see a vision of her deceased daughter again.
It's a heartbreaking detail, but it tells us something vital about the phenomenological nature of the intoxication.
How so?
Well, the visions aren't perceived as transparent overlays or just fleeting tricks of the light. They are integrated into the user's reality with absolute solidity.
They feel completely real.
Entirely real.
With an effect this powerful, you would naturally assume that modern pharmacology would have mapped out exactly where these grow, what species they are, and isolated the chemical years ago.
You would think so.
But the geographic timeline of this mystery is a total roller coaster. Let's trace the historical breadcrumb trail. We're going to travel far away from the mountains of China, down to the western highlands of Papua New Guinea, specifically looking at the Kuma people.
This is where Western science first attempted and completely failed to catalog this phenomenon.
The historical record here starts in 1936.
Right? When a missionary reported that native populations in the Papua New Guinea highlands were consuming a type of bolete mushroom that caused extreme behavioral shifts. He described it simply as mushroom madness.
Mushroom madness. But it wasn't rigorously studied then.
No, it wasn't until the late 1950s that an anthropologist named Marie Ray actually embedded with the Kuma people and documented this mushroom madness in much greater detail. And crucially, she reported that the mushrooms were causing Lilliputian hallucinations.
The tiny people again.
The exact same symptom. And this detail caught the attention of two legendary figures in ethnomycology, Gordon Wasson and Roger Heim.
They were absolute titans of their field at the time.
Yes, they were. In the mid-1960s, Wasson and Heim traveled to Papua New Guinea. They surveyed around 400 different local mushrooms and eventually narrowed the culprit down to 6 species reportedly causing this madness.
With the primary suspect being a blue-staining bolete called Boletes manicus.
Right.
And Wasson and Heim didn't mess around. Heim took physical samples of Boletes manicus, preserved them, and sent them to Switzerland to be analyzed by a chemist named Albert Hofmann.
And for anyone who doesn't recognize that name, Albert Hofmann is the scientist who synthesized and discovered LSD.
He is arguably the greatest analytical chemist in the history of hallucinogens. If there was a psychoactive compound hiding in that mushroom, Hofmann was the man to find it.
But Hofmann hit an absolute wall.
Really?
Yeah, he put the samples through rigorous analysis and did manage to isolate trace amounts of 3 unidentified indolic compounds.
Indoles being the chemical class that includes powerful neurotransmitters and psychedelics like serotonin, LSD, and psilocybin.
Exactly. The problem was the yield. The quantities he found were so microscopic that they couldn't even be properly identified with the technology of the era.
Oh, wow.
For those specific trace amounts to be the root cause of the intense mushroom madness described by Marie Ray, the undiscovered chemical would have to be unbelievably potent. We're talking about something active at the microgram level.
Literally on par with the potency of LSD itself.
Exactly.
And because Hoffman couldn't hand them a neat, chemically identified smoking gun, Wasson and Heim made a pivot that, in retrospect, feels incredibly arrogant.
It really does. Heim decided to try eating tiny, cautious amounts of the mushroom himself. When he only experienced some strange dreams and no obvious waking hallucinations, they essentially threw out the biological explanation entirely.
We just gave up on it.
They officially concluded that the Kuma people's mushroom madness wasn't pharmacological at all. They labeled it a form of social catharsis.
Basically saying the indigenous population was just ritualistically acting out, using the mushroom as a cultural excuse to behave wildly.
It is a textbook example of how a rigid scientific paradigm can blind researchers to reality. Because a mid-century European chemist couldn't isolate the compound, and because a Western researcher didn't hallucinate after taking a subperceptual dose.
They completely dismissed the lived, documented experiences of an entire culture. It's infuriating. And the real tragedy is that because Wasson and Heim dismissed it as mere theater, the phenomenon wasn't rigorously studied for decades.
The scientific community just moved on.
Right. Fast forward to 2006, researchers finally go back to that specific village in Papua New Guinea, only to find that the local ancestral knowledge of these mushrooms is almost entirely gone.
The last known incidence of them being consumed for this purpose was in the mid-1980s.
So when modern mycologists Bryn Dentinger and Colin Domnauer traveled back to Papua New Guinea in December of 2025, specifically hunting for Wasson and Heim's lost mushrooms, they couldn't even find them.
It seemed like a total scientific dead end. The habitat had changed, the cultural knowledge had faded.
But the global map of this phenomenon was about to expand. Domnauer didn't let the Papua New Guinea dead end stop the research. Which brings us to a much more recent breakthrough geographical connection.
Yes.
In 2024, Domnauer traveled to the Cordillera Mountains in the northern Philippines, specifically focusing on an area called Sagada.
And what he found there completely shatters the social catharsis theory Wasson and Heim proposed.
Totally. In the Philippines, Domnauer documented local populations who regularly forage and eat a type of blue-staining bolete they call seedstem.
And the locals explain that, irregularly, eating these specific mushrooms causes people to see visions of what they call the ancestor.
Which translates, once again, to little people.
We now have completely independent, geographically isolated cultures. The Kuma people in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the foragers in the mountains of Philippines, and the massive populations in the Yunnan province of China.
3 distinct cultures, separated by thousands of miles and oceans.
All reporting the exact same hyper-specific Lilliputian hallucinations resulting from the consumption of local blue-staining bolete mushrooms.
That level of cross-cultural independent consistency makes the idea of localized mass hysteria or theatrical acting statistically impossible.
It strongly, undeniably points to a shared, highly specific pharmacological agent working on the human brain.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. In Papua New Guinea and the Philippines, encountering these visions seems like a relatively rare, irregular occurrence. But in Yunnan, China, these mushrooms are not some hidden fringe oddity.
No, not at all.
They are a massive, highly sought-after culinary staple. The locals refer to them as giant shaoqing, which directly translates to turns blue when bruised.
You can walk into everyday markets and see them piled high.
They are incredibly popular, often more prized than standard porcini mushrooms because they have this incredibly rich, deep umami flavor. But eating them requires following a very strict zero margin for error cooking rule.
The culinary practice in Yunnan is essentially a game of chemical Russian roulette.
It really is.
The local knowledge dictates that these mushrooms must be sliced thin and cooked at a high heat for a very specific window of time, typically at least 15 to 25 minutes.
And if prepared correctly, the intense heat completely denatures or destroys the hallucinogenic compounds.
Rendering the mushroom perfectly safe, non-toxic, and delicious. But if the cook is impatient, or if the slices are too thick and the core doesn't reach the required temperature,
You're gonna meet the Xiao Ren.
undercook your dinner by 3 minutes and you're staring at an army of tiny men on your plate.
And this dangerous culinary tightrope isn't some modern foodie fad. The historical documentation of this exact practice in China is ancient.
We can look at a Chinese Taoist text authored by a scholar named Ge Hong around the year 300 CE.
We are talking over 1700 years ago.
Yes. Ge Hong describes something he calls a flesh spirit mushroom. His text includes this remarkable quote. He wrote, "If you see a little person 7 to 8 kun tall riding in a carriage when you travel on a mountain, you have encountered a flesh spirit mushroom. Consume it raw and you will attain transcendence immediately."
And 7 to 8 kun translates to roughly 3 to 33 centimeters.
It perfectly matches the descriptions from the 1991 hospital report.
Over a millennia later, Ge Hong basically wrote a recipe that says, Step 1, look for the tiny man in the tiny carriage. It proves that the link between these specific mushrooms and Lilliputian hallucinations has been a recognized part of human knowledge for nearly 2,000 years.
And that deep cultural integration leads to some fascinating modern clashes. Because the mushroom is viewed primarily as a food source rather than a drug, its presence in high-end cuisine is totally normalized in Yunnan.
Which brings us to the international incident.
The dinner.
The dinner. In 2023, the United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was on a diplomatic trip to China. She and her team went out to dinner at a very popular, reputable restaurant in Yunnan.
And they ordered a local specialty mushroom dish.
It turned out to be a dish made entirely of Lanmawa asiatica, the hallucinogenic boletes. When the news broke back in the U.S., it caused a massive media frenzy.
The reaction highlighted a profound difference in cultural framing.
How so?
Well, the Western media immediately latched onto the hallucinogenic aspect. They were trying to figure out if a high-ranking government official had unwittingly consumed a psychedelic drug during a sensitive diplomatic mission.
Right.
But within the cultural context of Yunnan, the restaurant had simply served a premium local delicacy. Because the chefs were professionals who cooked the mushrooms properly for the required time, the psychoactive compounds were entirely inactivated.
Secretary Yellen didn't hallucinate. She later gave interviews noting she had no idea the mushrooms had that potential until she read the news and simply stated that the dish was delicious.
In the West, a hallucinogenic property immediately throws an organism into the category of a controlled substance, a taboo drug, or strictly clinical medicine.
But in Yunnan, the culinary experience takes absolute precedence. The hallucinogen is merely viewed as a naturally occurring toxin.
An inconvenience that needs to be boiled out.
Yeah, no different than boiling a raw kidney bean to neutralize its natural poisons before making chili.
Exactly. It's a pragmatic gastronomic approach to a potent neurotoxin.
So let's look at the board. We have a family of mushrooms that causes armies of tiny people to march across your vision. It's been meticulously documented for 1,700 years. It's sold in open-air markets by the ton to the point where U.S. government officials are casually eating it for dinner.
Right.
Which begs the absolute most obvious question I can think of. It is 2026. We can sequence entire genomes in an afternoon. We have AI modeling protein structures. Why don't we know what chemical causes this yet? What is the holdup?
The holdup is that we are dealing with a true taxonomic and chemical nightmare.
Okay.
First, we have to address the identification problem. You mentioned earlier that we are looking for blue-staining boletes. The issue is a biological phenomenon known as convergent evolution.
Meaning different species evolving identical traits independently over time.
Precisely. Because of convergent evolution, many completely distinct species of boletes have evolved to look almost exactly identical to one another, including that rapid blue-staining defense mechanism.
So they all look the same.
They do. The most frequently implicated species in the Yunnan hospital reports is currently identified as Lanmawa asiatica. But that specific species wasn't even officially described and named by science until 2015.
Just a little over a decade ago.
Right. Before that, it was just lazily lumped in with the generic group of European Boletes species. And on top of the taxonomy issues, you have the practical reality of foraging. The locals in Yunnan don't just pick one type of mushroom. They forage and consume hundreds of different species.
The mixed basket problem.
Exactly. When a patient arrives at the hospital in a state of stupor, hallucinating tiny people, they usually can't point to the exact mushroom that did it.
Because they ate a mixed stir-fry.
Yes. So researchers are constantly struggling to verify if they're studying the single true source species or if the Xiao-Ren-Ren effect is actually the result of an entourage effect.
A complex chemical reaction caused by combining multiple different fungal species in the same meal.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it demonstrates how difficult it is to isolate a novel compound when you can't even lock down the foundational biology of the source material with absolute certainty.
It sounds incredibly frustrating for the chemists. But we do have a few solid pieces of the puzzle. Specifically, we have definitively ruled out the usual suspects. We know it is absolutely not psilocybin.
Modern testing has confirmed that.
And the genetic research has closed some other major doors. In 2023, Colin Domnauer and Bryn Dentinger, the researchers who tracked the phenomenon to the Philippines, they ran a major genetics study. They sequenced the DNA of 12 different species within the Lanmaoa genus.
They were specifically looking for something called horizontal gene transfer.
Right. Testing the hypothesis that these boletes somehow stole the genetic instructions for producing known hallucinogens from other mushroom families, like psilocybe or amanita.
Over millions of years of shared environmental proximity, yeah. But the DNA sequencing yielded zero evidence of that.
Not at all.
None. These boletes completely lack the biosynthetic gene clusters required to produce any of the known fungal hallucinogens.
So they aren't just a new delivery system for an old chemical.
No. The genetic data points toward a thrilling conclusion. We are looking at the existence of an entirely novel, completely undiscovered class of psychoactive compounds.
This is incredible.
And the renowned ethnobotanist Dennis McKenna has weighed in on the pharmacology based purely on the symptomology. Looking at the profound stupor, the deeply immersive and bizarre nature of the visions, and the extreme duration, McKenna suggests the mechanism of action might be akin to a datura-style anticholinergic delirium.
How does that differ from a classic psychedelic trip?
Well, classic psychedelics generally leave the user with an intact ego. They know they are hallucinating.
They can ground themselves.
Usually, yes.
Oh.
But anticholinergics work by blocking the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the central nervous system. This induces a state of true delirium, where the user absolutely cannot distinguish the hallucination from baseline reality.
They interact with the phantoms as if they are entirely real.
Which perfectly aligns with the reports of patients trying to talk to little people or running away from phantom animals.
So where does the hunt stand right now, today? The source material notes that as of late 2025 and early 2026, Domnauer and Dentinger are deep in laboratory trials.
They've successfully moved past the genetic sequencing and into animal testing.
They are taking raw chemical extracts directly from Lanmaoa asiatica and administering them to mice in controlled settings, and they are finally seeing measurable physical results.
The mice are exhibiting intense periods of hyperactivity, immediately followed by a very long, profound stupor.
A behavioral pattern that perfectly mirrors the human clinical reports from that 1991 hospital study. They are aggressively working on isolating the exact active constituents from those extracts and are preparing to publish their definitive findings very soon.
Late 2025 or early 2026.
After nearly a century of dead ends, from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the laboratories of today, we might be just months away from one of the biggest breakthroughs in modern ethnopharmacology. So, what does this all mean?
For you listening, I think the most profound takeaway is a necessary humbling of our modern perspective.
I agree.
We live in an incredibly advanced digitized age where it is so easy to arrogantly assume that science has successfully mapped the natural world. We assume we know all the chemicals, all the biological mechanisms, and that there are no major surprises left in our own backyards.
That there are.
Yet here is an entirely novel, incredibly potent, deeply complex, undiscovered class of psychoactive compounds hiding in plain sight. It's not locked away in some inaccessible, unexplored deep-sea trench. It is sitting quietly inside a popular, delicious, edible mushroom sold by the ton in everyday markets, eaten by thousands of normal people.
It serves as a stark reminder of the vast, untapped chemical potential of the natural world that is still waiting to be understood, provided we have the patience to look closely. It really does. And I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We know that the intense mind-altering properties of these bolete mushrooms compounds, powerful enough to conjure literal armies of tiny people in your kitchen, are completely destroyed by a simple 15-minute boil.
That's all it takes to erase the magic entirely.
It makes you wonder, what other completely undiscovered, radically mind-altering compounds might be hiding in the everyday foods we eat? Are there other profound neurochemical secrets locked away in the produce aisle of our grocery stores, forever hidden from human experience simply because our culinary culture, over thousands of years of trial and error, has taught us to always cook them first?
It's a wild thought.
Next time you boil a vegetable for dinner, just think about what unseen molecular structures you might be destroying in the process. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.